All right, there we go. Hi, everyone. I see some people are starting to filter in, so we'll go ahead and introduce our presentation. Thanks so much for joining us for this month's Red Hill Rediscovered lecture on the archaeology of double cabins. My name is Lucia Butler. I'm one of the staff archaeologists at Red Hill, and I am joined today by our new staff archaeologist, Margaret.
Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today.
So first of all, happy Virginia Archaeology Month. It is indeed Virginia Archaeology Month. So for this Red Hill Rediscovered, we wanted to dive into some of the current archaeology that Red Hill has been doing, what we're learning from it. So Margaret and I are going to share some of the historical background of the Double Cabin site, which is the site we've been working on. And then we're going to get into the details of this past summer's excavation, some of our preliminary findings, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So please leave a comment on our live stream if you have a question at any point, and we will answer those at the end. So we will get started with some of the historical context of the site we're looking at. This year, our work focuses on a site on Quarter Place. And if you're not already familiar, Quarter Place is a part of Red Hill's property in the woods northwest of the main plantation house. Quarter Place was where enslaved African Americans and later free sharecroppers lived, worked, and buried their deceased. The landscape of Quarter Place in the 18th and 19th centuries would have included somewhere around 12 living quarters to house enslaved and freed field workers, as well as agricultural structures such as this tobacco barn, which still stands on the trail today. And at the end of the trail that runs through Quarter Place is a cemetery which holds the graves of 147 people. Enslaved people at Quarter Place lived at Quarter Place as early as the 1770s when Red Hill first became a tobacco plantation. And by 1799, a historical inventory tells us there were 67 enslaved men, women, and children living at Red Hill. So we know that the Quarter Place community in the 18th and 19th centuries was made up of people of all ages, from infants to elderly people. It was made up of families, and it would have been a place that was filled with the activity of daily life and community making. After the Civil War, tobacco production continued at Red Hill under the system of sharecropping, which was an arrangement where the harvested crop would be split between the free farmers who worked the land and the landowner. And although the freedmen who became sharecroppers were no longer legally enslaved, they were often still limited both by cycles of debt that were built into the sharecropping system, as well as by the laws and the social environment of the Jim Crow South. At Red Hill in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tenant farmers, domestic servants, and their families rented outbuildings on the property. And in 1936, it was recorded that 6 Black families were living in several tenant houses, which likely included a few structures on the main grounds, such as the kitchen and servants' house pictured here, as well as dwellings at Quarter Place, such as the double cabins. Now, as far as location, the double cabin site is the feature labeled B right here on this visitor's map of the Quarter Place Trail. If you're standing on the trail at that spot, the site is visible about 50 feet to the north. So what is actually there at the site? Well, the double cabins are no longer standing, but for about 60 years, the remains of their above-ground stone foundations have marked the places where they once stood. So the foundations have been a known cultural resource, and they've been an important interpretive feature on the Quarter Place Trail. But we felt that we could better tell their stories with what we would learn from an archaeological investigation. Which brings us to the first step of our investigation, researching what was already known about the double cabins and determining what other questions we might have that we might be able to answer with archaeological research. So what did we know about the cabins beforehand? There are 3 photos of the cabins from the mid-20th century that have lent to Red Hill's interpretation, particularly these 2. They show the cabins from 2 different angles. And you'll notice that they sit quite close together. They're both situated on these above-ground stone foundations. These are log structures with rubberoid covering what is most likely a metal roof, and they both have stovepipes coming from their roofs. By this time, they look to be in rough shape with broken windows and broken steps, so most likely no one was living there at that point. And if we look at the differences between the cabins, this is where it starts to get interesting. The eastern cabin, which is the one on the right in both photos, has a front-facing window on its lower floor, as well as windows facing east and west on its second floor. And the western cabin does not have a front-facing window, but it does have one facing east, directly into the side of the neighboring cabin. So why have a window that faces into a wall? It's possible that the western cabin was constructed first, with the eastern window originally able to let in the morning light, but was then blocked by the construction of the eastern cabin. We can also see that the eastern cabin had a lean-to at the back. In the photo on the right-hand side, you can see where the roof kind of slopes down over that section on the back. And there's another architectural difference between the two cabins that has raised questions in our interpretation about the differences and how they were used. The historical photographs show us that each cabin had a wood stove for heating, but in the eastern cabin, the remains of a hearth were visible on the ground surface, surrounded by a stone chimney fall. So that tells us that the eastern cabin originally had a hearth and a stone chimney for its heat source, which was later taken out and replaced by the wood stove. In the photograph as well, we can see the faint scar from where the chimney was on the exterior of the eastern wall in that cabin. However, with the western cabin, we don't see any evidence of it having had a hearth and chimney, neither in the structural remains nor in the archival evidence. So if the western structure did not have a heat source prior to the installation of the wood stove, then it may have originally served a function other than as a living quarter, possibly as a workshop or a storage space. And then we've got this appraisal of Red Hill from 1941 that describes some of the tenant houses on the property, their appraised values, and some of the occupants. The dwelling that's listed as settlement number 2 describes double log cabins with rubberoid roofing, 3 rooms on the first floor and 2 rooms on the second floor. And if we count the rooms of the 2 cabins all together, then this description exactly fits the site that we're looking at. This appraisal also gives us the only name we know so far of someone who lived in these cabins. Jesse Cook would have been around 17 years old at the time this inventory was taken. He was the son of Walter Cook Sr. and Izora Hamlet Cook, both of whom had passed away the year prior to the appraisal. Walter, Jesse's father, had worked as the caretaker of Red Hill for 25 years, and Jesse himself worked as a farm laborer. Jesse was also one of 12 children born to Walter and Izora, so it's not unlikely that some of his siblings may have been living in the cabins as well in 1941. So this gives us an idea of how the cabins were used later in Red Hill's history. Jesse Cook might have been the last occupant of the cabins since the Patrick Henry Memorial Foundation took over Red Hill in 1945, and by the spring of that year, there were no tenants living on the property. So what happened to the cabins? Well, in architect Stanhope Johnson's specifications for the restoration of Red Hill, he stipulates that stones from the foundations of a blacksmith's cabin and 2 other cabins should be removed and reused in the reconstruction of Harrison's cabin, which stands on the main grounds today. It's very possible that the double cabins were the 2 cabins that Johnson was referring to. When we look at those stone foundation remains, we see that they are fallen and incomplete in many places. So all I'll say is that the preservation of Red Hill's historic structures has certainly come a long way since the 1960s. And the last bit of background knowledge we have on these cabins comes from the analysis of some of the architectural materials found on the surface of the foundation remains, namely the nails. There are 3 types of nails that help archaeologists and architectural historians very broadly date buildings. First, you have hand-wrought nails, which, as the name suggests, were handmade by blacksmiths, and these are the earliest type usually dating to the 18th century. Machine-cut nails gradually replaced hand-wrought nails over the course of the 19th century, and then wire nails became more prominent in the 1890s and are still used today. So at the double cabin site, both machine-cut and wire nails were found. In the case of this photograph, we've found both types nailed into the same timber. So as far as the cabin's construction, the machine-cut nails tell us that these structures were built sometime in the 19th century. And since they continue to be used into the early 20th century, repairs would have been made using the wire nails. So before we began digging into the site, we had some general information about the history of these cabins from the photographs, the archival documents, and what could be seen on the ground surface. We know that these cabins were constructed in the 19th century, they were used up into the 1940s, and were demolished in the 1960s. The eastern cabin was constructed with a hearth and stone chimney, suggesting that it was lived in, while the western cabin did not have a heat source prior to the wood stove. The structures were repaired and improved through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, indicating continued use during that time. And one feature I haven't mentioned yet, the location of privies some ways north of the cabins was identified during a survey by Browning and Associates in 1989. Now, while we had this information about the cabins, it still left us with some questions. So first, we wanted to know more about the time period of construction. At what point in the 19th century were they constructed? What was the sequence of construction if the cabins were not built at the same time? And for how long were they occupied? We also had questions about the function of the western cabin. If it wasn't constructed with a heat source like the eastern cabin, then what was it intended for? Another question was about who lived in the cabins throughout time and what was life at Quarter Place like for them. And then finally, we wanted to learn more about the spaces outside of the cabin walls, what was around these structures, and how did people use the outside space. So these were the questions we sought to address through archaeology.
In June of this year, fieldwork at the double cabin site began. We gathered our team, which consisted of 9 Longwood University archaeology folks, go Wood, and 1 student from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And together, we packed our equipment and headed out into the field. So what does it really mean to do fieldwork? There are many ways, but fieldwork consists of the systematic recovery of archaeological data, including artifacts, features, and more. The methods vary depending on the site, but can include survey and excavation. So we're all on the same page. Here's a brief glossary of the vocabulary we use every day. Starting off with something you are probably familiar with. An artifact is an object that has been made or modified by humans, often with historical or cultural significance. While artifacts can be picked up and moved around, features are non-portable elements of a site made by human activity, so things like storage pits and privies. These features can be excavated, and for excavation, the basic toolkit usually includes shovels, trowels, scoops, buckets, and sifting screens. And this excavation takes place within a unit, which in the case of the double cabin site, our units encompassed the cabin foundations. And within those units, each artifact that is found has provenience, and that refers to its precise location in space. This can be recorded by the excavator along with the context of an artifact, so how an artifact relates to other artifacts and the site itself, often showing function and use of an object or area. To give more context to excavation, my favorite description of it comes from Philip Barker in his book, The Techniques of Archaeological Excavation, saying, "Every archaeological site is itself a document. It can be read by a skilled excavator, but it is destroyed by the very process of reading it." This really emphasizes the importance of the concepts I mentioned before and the diligence that archaeology requires, as well as how proper documentation is necessary because you can't read a site twice. Now we can get our hands dirty as we explore how we applied those archaeological concepts to the double cabin site this summer. Before putting a shovel into the ground, walking around and inspecting the site is necessary to decide the proper excavation method to use. On the surface of the site, there were foundation stones, decomposing timbers, scattered bricks, and many nails. After a visual inspection, the first step was to remove the natural accumulation of debris and soils and set up our unit boundaries. As we cleared the ground, the stones multiplied and became more prominent, revealing much more of the structure than we could see before on the surface. Once the exterior walls of the foundation were defined, we moved to excavating the interior of the cabins, layer by layer recording the artifacts where we found them, capturing important location information that will be helpful during analysis. Once we excavated the cabin subsoil, which here at Red Hill is indeed red clay, we moved on to the west cabin, a much smaller unit, taking us less time to excavate. As artifacts are recovered, they are left in their original locations in the dirt. But that dirt is then removed and placed into a bucket where it is carried to a sifter by the excavator and screened for any artifacts that may have been missed when troweling. Trowel passes, which is what the team was doing in the last picture, were repeated over the site until the excavation was completed, reaching that red clay subsoil I mentioned before. In this picture, you can see one of our team members, Gabe, sifting his bucket of dirt, breaking up the clumps of clay, making sure that he hasn't left any artifacts behind. And identifying these artifacts in the sifter is a skill built on experience, requiring a discerning eye. While you can tell really easily the difference between a piece of ceramic and a rock when it is cleaned off, it's not so easy when everything is camouflaged in dirt. Once we finished with the excavations, stonemasons from Schrader Stone began their work preserving the foundations by reconstructing them using the original stones and others from the surrounding area. This took them about 3 weeks to complete, dry stacking them as you see in the picture. This preservation allows the site to be better interpreted, and it is easier to imagine what the cabins may have looked like as they stood there not so long ago. All throughout the process of excavation and recovery of archaeological data, we documented everything that we possibly could. Between note-taking, photography, and mapping, making a detailed record of the site involves many different mediums, applying what we can to create the thickest, most complete record of what we see in the field. The first layer of that effort is recording forms. For each feature or context, we fill out forms which record valuable information about location, size, artifact contents, depth, and more. But that alone is not enough to get the full picture of a site. Building off of that, photography, when used effectively, obviously gives us a great picture of the site. Here are pictures of freshly excavated artifacts in the west cabin. As we traveled, we left them where they surfaced, and as you can see, the floor was covered in glass in some places. There were far too many artifacts for us to draw in on the field maps, so we made the decision to photograph them instead. With those pictures, we can reconstruct what the cabins looked like with the artifacts in their original places and their locations within the stone foundation walls. Along with the general finds in the photo, the orange flags are the locations of special finds, which are artifacts we consider to be diagnostic, so anything we can date or research more deeply. Also in the picture, you can see subtle color differences in the soil across the foundation's interior. These soil differences can be indicative of several things, and they are something that we keep a record of in the field for each context or feature that we opened. To do this, we use the Munsell color system, which standardizes color description, making sure all archaeologists can understand the colors we are seeing in the field. The final layer of documentation I want to talk about is mapping, which is one of the more time-consuming aspects of archaeology. Here you can see a field map, a horizontal slice of space that shows every foundation stone and artifact from a particular layer of archaeology, as if we were taking an aerial photograph of the site. These are no small feat. Each individual foundation stone, brick, and artifact is drawn in, making quite a detailed and complex 2D visual of the cabins. On the right, you can see a slightly closer view of the larger map on the left. These maps are vital in understanding the structure of the cabins and how the stones looked in the field as we excavated, making sure we are recording the site carefully through every process of excavation. Here you can see two of our team members, Lily and Hannah, mapping the site. We break down the site into 1 meter by 1 meter squares, forming a grid, and then those correspond to a grid on the papers that they are holding. This process allows us to create a scaled down drawing of the foundation stones and artifacts as the team members see them, so we have a record of their locations before we remove them. While this may seem old-fashioned, it provides tangible results, especially when coupled with more modern methods. Using technology like Adobe Illustrator, we can take those field maps and create digital drawings like you see here. And this is something I really love to do. It provides a much cleaner and simpler picture of the aerial views of the cabins, less dirt and distractions, and the data is better communicated. Now that you have a better view of the foundations from above, we can talk about a few realizations we had about certain structural elements of the cabins as the project progressed. The first thing that we noticed in the field, shout out Dr. Mark Costro, was that the lean-to was added on as a later addition to the main structure of the east cabin. If it were a planned part of the structure from the beginning, there likely would not be this solid foundation wall separating the two rooms, but instead a more minor wooden separating wall that wouldn't have survived the demolition. The other structural element that we observed was that when the stone chimney was taken out in the late 19th century, the hole that was left in the wall was filled in by bricks, which explains the cluster of them by the hearth. And thanks to the digital drawings, you can see a crisp picture of that. Digital drawings are also useful for artifacts. Illustrating the artifacts allows you to see details that you may have not noticed in the photographs. These are two artifacts that we found at the double cabin site. You can see each individual flake and ridge in the projectile point and the subtle pattern that decorates the top of the watch case, which otherwise was not entirely visible in the photograph. And on top of the increased level of detail, you can also keep the drawing scaled to the size of the original, which for these photos, each one of those black and white squares is equal to 1 centimeter. So we can create accurate depictions of each artifact. By the end of our excavation, we had accumulated a large quantity of artifacts, like the ones you just saw. So what happens to them once they are excavated? They are taken back to our lab and then sent through a process that ensures proper care is taken for each artifact. They are cleaned and then cataloged, which means they are sorted, counted, and identified, and then labeled accordingly. To catch artifacts that may have been too small and would have fallen through the sifter in the field, we take soil samples and put them through a process called flotation. Soil flotation uses water and sieves to release any light or heavy fractions within the soil, revealing any organic particles or small finds that we may have missed otherwise. This picture shows our team in the lab cleaning artifacts on one of the very few days we couldn't be in the field this summer. Once the team cleans the artifacts, we can begin analyzing them. At this point in the project, we have not been able to catalog and analyze every piece of the artifact assemblage, so research is still ongoing. But we can give you a look into some of our preliminary findings based on the 6,000 artifacts we have cataloged so far. The artifact assemblage is vast in its contents, ranging from everyday household products to more personal items. To get a better understanding of the contents of this assemblage, here is a pie chart showing the artifacts we have cataloged broken down into groups: architecture, kitchen, clothing, personal, unidentified, and other. As you can see, most of the artifacts we have cataloged fall under the architecture group, with the kitchen group as the second largest slice. Within those groups, the artifacts can be broken up by type, as you can see in this next pie chart. These types include ceramic, metal, glass, synthetic, composite, organic, and other. These categories give us a closer idea as to what kinds of things were used at the site. Out of these types, metal artifacts are the clear majority due to the large amount of nails we found at the site, including both cut and wire varieties. This goes along with the pie chart showing the different groupings, with architecture having the largest slice. Glass artifacts are the second largest category, which is made up of kitchen products, medicinal bottles, as well as glassware such as plates, cups, and bowls. Breaking down the nail data a bit, here are the percentages of wire nails and cut nails, with wire nails at 65% and cut nails at 35% of the total nails cataloged so far. And because of this disparity, it suggests that more repairs and renovations were done to the cabins from 1890 forward. It is important to note that we have only cataloged a small part of the artifacts that were found at the site, but it would be reasonable to assume that this trend would continue as we catalog more nails. After the entire artifact assemblage is cataloged, we plan to do a more in-depth analysis of nail types across the site to see if the percentages are consistent, and if not, what can those differences in distribution tell us? Ceramics are another diagnostic tool, allowing us to determine a more accurate chronology of the site. Each type has certain date ranges, some more specific than others. And you can break down ceramic types into distinct categories, including groups determined by surface decoration. Out of the catalog material so far, whiteware encompasses the majority of ceramics. The earliest that this ceramic ware was produced was 1830, and it is still being produced today. With this type of data, we can begin to imagine the lives of the people living along the Quarter Place Trail. Each item contributes to a fuller story about the people who once called the cabins home.
All right, so circling back to some of our research questions from the beginning, while we're still in the midst of cataloging and analysis of the assemblage from the double cabins, we have been able to draw a few findings from what we've looked at so far. Most of the artifacts we've been able to date come from the later occupation of the cabins, so the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, and that does help us fill in our knowledge of the sharecropping period at Red Hill. In terms of what the artifacts tell us about the people associated with the cabins and their daily lives, we see a lot of the personal artifacts pointing to families residing in these cabins. So items such as a brooch, a lipstick tube, fragments of hot combs, and a hair barrette show us a bit about the daily lives of a woman or women living there in the early 20th century, and a few other artifacts, including pieces of a toy tea set and a porcelain doll arm, tell us that children lived there. We also see artifacts relating to farm work that the cabin's occupants were engaged in, including a piece of a plow, which should be an image on here, I apologize for that, and horseshoes as well. Among the many pieces of ceramic found at the site, which Margaret has described, there were a few sherds of porcelain and imported ceramic wares, and that shows us that the residents of the cabins had access to a few finer materials, either by way of purchasing them themselves or getting them secondhand from the Henry family. We also encountered several product containers with embossed labels that tell us about the items that the cabin residents and, more broadly, the Quarter Place community had access to and used in their daily lives. Things like Fletcher's Castoria, which was kind of a medicine, Lee and Perrin's Worcestershire sauce, and Parker ink. So in the early 20th century, we're seeing the Quarter Place residents had access to manufactured goods, likely purchased from stores in Brookneal. And we see that the Quarter Place community has shifted from the self-sustaining plantation model, where everything they needed was made on site, over to having more access and more reliance on consumer goods. And also having these kinds of artifacts that have specific dates of manufacture helps us to put together the timeline for the occupation of these cabins. So for example, in the eastern cabin, we found an iron panel from the wood stove that bears the manufacturer's name, Phillips and Butorf Manufacturing Company. They were based in Nashville, Tennessee, and that company was incorporated in 1881. Other pieces of the stove that were discovered have decoration that is more Victorian in style. So we are able to date the cabin's wood stoves to the last 2 decades of the 19th century. Coins are also immensely helpful with dating a site. 18 coins were discovered in and around the foundations, mostly dimes and pennies dating between 1904 and 1940. And there was one coin found in the eastern cabin that was kind of an outlier in a few ways. Surprisingly, this is an 1868 Spanish coin worth 10 escudos. It bears the likeness of Queen Isabel II on one side and the Spanish coat of arms on the other. It has also been pierced through the top, which indicates it may have been made into jewelry or some other kind of decoration. And this artifact has raised a lot of questions for us. How did it end up at Quarter Place? Did someone from here travel overseas, or did they receive this from a traveler? And what did it mean to the person who owned it? Going by the piercing at the top, it seems like it certainly did carry some meaning, and we're working on researching and piecing together the story behind this artifact and what it tells us about the people who lived in the double cabins. So a lot of times we get the question, what is the oldest artifact you've found? And for the double cabin site, we can answer that pretty definitely with these stone projectile points like this one. These points were made by Native American flint knappers in the mid to late Archaic period between 6500 and 1200 BC. The indigenous people who lived on the land that became Red Hill were of Saponi culture. The Saponi tribe today is a state-recognized tribe on the Virginia-North Carolina border. And archaeological evidence shows us that historically the Saponi lived on this land year-round. They constructed homes and hunted seasonal game. So there were 4 complete projectile points found at the double cabin site, along with 4 broken or unfinished stone tools. Indigenous stone tools like these have been found all around Red Hill, but the context that these were in, which was in and around the footprint of cabins, suggests that these were collected by residents of those cabins. The people of Quarter Place might have known a little bit about the indigenous history of the land, and just like us, they were probably curious about the past and about the people who came before them and the materials those people left behind. So not only do the lithics from this site tell us about the native peoples who were here, but also about the interest that the Quarter Place residents took in collecting artifacts like these. So to sum it up, here's an overview of what we've learned so far from our excavation and ongoing analysis. And it is ongoing, so there is sure to be more that we will learn in the coming months. So looking at the structural remains of the double cabins, we've determined that the lean-to at the back of the eastern cabin was a later addition and was not part of the original construction. We also determined that the machine-made bricks that were found around the eastern cabin's hearth were not part of the fireplace, but were used as material to patch the hole that was left by removal of the stone chimney. And for that particular conclusion, I have to credit Cody Youngblood, our Director of Historic Preservation and Collections. He offered a lot of insight about building practices during this investigation. So with the artifacts we've analyzed so far, we can see that the majority reflect a domestic use of the cabins in the early 20th century. These were places where food was prepared and stored and where personal items were kept. We also see evidence in the artifacts that families lived in these cabins. And we see that by the early 20th century, the residents had access to manufactured products and even a few finer materials such as porcelain. We know from the historical context that sharecropping was not an easy life, and there were many inequalities and challenges that the Quarter Place community would have faced in the late 19th and early 20th century period. But by analyzing the material culture and the structural remains of the cabins that they lived in, we can see how the residents were making their own lives with what they had, and we get a better understanding of life on Quarter Place.
So now that we have taken you through the investigation of the double cabins, what is next for archaeology at Red Hill? We have plenty of analysis left to do at the double cabins, like Lucia said. But in the summer of 2026, we plan to excavate at the site of a 19th century kitchen that once stood on Red Hill's historic grounds, which is depicted here in the watercolor from 1904. Stay in touch with Red Hill throughout the next year to learn more about this intriguing site. And of course, we can't end this without saying a big thank you to our field crew from this summer, all of the volunteers we had, the stonemasons who did such a great job on the reconstruction, and everyone who has supported and taken interest in Red Hills archaeology. Thank you. And with that, it is time for the Q&A part of today's presentation. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat. We would love to answer them.
All right, so looks like we've got one from Courtney Hollingsworth. Does Red Hill have any plans to survey or excavate any more areas of Quarter Place in the future? Yes. Yeah, we've got another part of this specific investigation of the double cabins. We will be doing in about a month or so a metal detector survey. If you remember from close to the start of the presentation, we mentioned one of our research questions was about what activities went on outside the cabin walls, what were the outside spaces used for. So we will be doing a survey around the cabin foundations to try and answer that question. As far as future projects, there are many places on Quarter Place that are left to discover, and many more questions we have. There are other cabin foundations that have been identified, other features related to the tobacco production process, the remains of a tobacco barn. So as far as the future in Red Hills archaeology, Quarter Place sites will likely play a big role in that. All right. We've got lots of questions.
Yeah, we have
we'll move along. Cindy Smith asks, do you plan to put some of the artifacts on display? If you want to take this one, Margaret.
So we do have some of the artifacts on display down in our archaeological lab, but we would love to expand that, hopefully to have some on display either at the exhibit cabin on the Quarter Place Trail or in the museum. That would be great.
Yeah. It'll be a little while before we have everything cataloged, and we'll have kind of a better idea of what we have and what the most important things to go on display are, or what stories we want to tell in our exhibits. But definitely there are, I'd say, many things from this excavation that can tell those stories about Quarter Place that I expect will go on display at some point in the future. Hope Marston asks, how many artifacts do you estimate you found? I'm going to pass this one to you, Margaret, because I think you did a little bit of the math on this.
I tried to crunch some numbers. While we haven't cataloged everything yet. We have cataloged 6,000 items so far, and based on that, I estimate that we have excavated over 30,000 artifacts. So we have a long ways to go.
We'll get back to you all at the end with the final count, but yeah. It'll be in the thousands. Courtney Hollingsworth asks, will this research be available for volunteers? Yes, we will be writing up a report of our findings, making that available definitely to Red Hill staff and to anyone else who is interested. Cindy Smith asks, were you surprised by any of your findings? What surprised you, Margaret?
I was just surprised at how much we found. My understanding was that we were going to be excavating a cabin that was mostly, people's trash they just things that they left behind before they moved. But to me, it feels like there's so much more than just like people's garbage. It's like people's belongings that were left there, and during the demolition, I assume they were destroyed. But that kind of is what surprised me, just the sheer amount of artifacts that we found.
Yeah, it was definitely many more than in the last two excavations that I've been part of at Red Hill. Yeah, it seems like a lot was just left there. For me, like specific artifacts, certainly the Spanish coin was a big surprise. I'd say at the beginning, finding porcelain at a site on Quarter Place was a surprise, but the more we found, the more we kind of understood this was, something that people had access to in the early 20th century.
And I guess the most recent finding, at least artifact-wise, that surprised me was the infantry button, the Civil War button. It's something we, should expect given the time period we thought these cabins were built and occupied. But I think that just provides more context to, what people's lives were like then.
Yeah, and this was something that I was originally going to have in the presentation, but with some technical difficulties, it got left out. So I'll really quickly go over, just recently, we identified in the assemblage a metal button, a domed metal button that it has a capital letter I on it, and one of our volunteers, Todd, actually identified this as a Confederate Army infantry button from a uniform. So this, again, is a very recent finding. We're still doing some more. We'll have to do some more research into that to see what it tells us about this site and about Quarter Place and kind of that connection to the Civil War. Okay, so let's see. Okay, Sydney Scottford asks, can you explain the grid system again and how that helps us to analyze the ground?
Okay, so we set up, so we take these nails and we measure across the site 1 meter by 1 meter squares, and we put those nails in the ground to create, the square. And we have another sort of grid device. So it's like a big yellow metal framed square with smaller red squares marking out 20 centimeter squares inside of that. And we lay that on the ground inside of the nails that we hammered into the ground. And then with that, we look at we have a piece of grid paper where we've like designated out those 1 meter by 1 meter squares. Of course, it's scaled down to fit on the page, but doing that and being able to, draw in the foundation stones and the artifacts as we see them in the ground, that's our only record of those things, essentially, before we remove them. So it's kind of important for, if we're trying to understand artifact concentration. So if there are certain groups of artifacts on the ground that we draw in, we're able to see what maybe those concentrations can mean and like indicate certain areas of activity through those artifact concentrations. And we're able to sort of visualize that on the papers, which that's why it's really important, is for analysis. But also just for the sake of recording the foundation stones in their original places before we move them, and same thing with the artifacts. I hope that answers your question. I know it's a little confusing.
It makes a little more sense when you're doing it in person in field, but no, I think you covered it, Mark.
Okay.
Cindy asks, do you need volunteers to help catalog your findings? We do need volunteers. With the cataloging, that's something Margaret and I kind of handle, but as far as Labeling artifacts, that's something we're going to need help with. When we get around to flotation, we can also use volunteer help with that too. So we will have opportunities open throughout the next few months for volunteers to help with this process and be involved in this process. Those opportunities, there's more information on our webpage, redhill.org/archaeology. You can find volunteer schedules, more information about what we're doing. And if you have any questions, do feel free to reach out to me or Margaret. Our emails are here on the page. Okay, Michelle asks, do we have any idea how many cabins were on Quarter Place Trail at any given time? And are there any other cabin remains left on the trail? Yes, so we estimate, just based on the number of enslaved people recorded at Red Hill in the inventories and the family groupings that they're in, our researchers have estimated about 12 quarters were on Quarter Place. There are other cabin remains that have been identified. I believe two other cabin remains have been identified so far. But Quarter Place is a big a big piece of land relatively, and there's a lot more that we will need to explore. So I would not be surprised if more foundations will be discovered in the future. All right. So Ethan asks, I think he had tried to ask a question earlier, but you got it this time. What is the one artifact you all found that gives the best overall impression of what exactly life was like in the cabins? That's a tricky one. Do you have anything that comes to mind, Margaret?
It's hard to pinpoint any one artifact because each artifact just like builds a bigger image of what life was like. So, but I feel like with individual artifacts, like let's say the hot comb, you can imagine someone using it and like you can picture their life and connect with them in that way. And I think especially with like the family artifacts like that, it sort of just shows that Quarter Place, they worked at Quarter Place, but it was also a place where people lived. And I think that is important to, I guess, that's an important impression to have from the artifacts.
Yeah, I agree. And I would, it's really hard to pick one artifact that represents someone's entire life. Like I would have a difficult time doing that for myself, much less like somebody whose life I know very little about and I'm trying to learn about. So having all the entire assemblage available for us to analyze is really important, and that's going to be some of our upcoming work. Our current and upcoming work is to look at all those pieces together and what do they tell us as a whole. But it's a good question, and it's one that I'm gonna keep thinking about.
Yeah, me too.
Let's see. All right, and I think that does it for our questions. So yeah, thank you everyone for all your questions. Thank you for tuning into this presentation and learning more about the archaeological work that we're doing here at Red Hill. If you have any other questions, do feel free to reach out to me or Margaret or comment on this video. And yeah, stay tuned for what is coming up next in Red Hill Archaeology. All right. Thanks you all. Bye.
Bye.